Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Good afternoon. I will give a presentation on the title Education Structures and Industrial Development, Lessons for Education Policies in African Countries. This paper explores the role of education in industrial development, and this work forms part of a wider research project at the ILO on productive transformation and job creation. And this project explores the different patterns of productive transformation and their potential to create productive and good jobs. And it aims at better understanding the role of country-specific conditions and in particular of capabilities and education in shaping the job and productivity enhancing patterns of productive transformation. What was the motivation to go into this research? This specific focus on education and industrial development was motivated by two important debates in development economics. First, there was a recent debate on growth. The recent debate on growth highlighted the importance of education for growth, but it was also concluded that economists have difficulties in showing this link between education and economic growth empirically, and also that economists lack a model to really explain the link between education and growth. This was the conclusion of the Commission on Growth and Development. And then we had a second debate, and this is what we are mainly discussing here. This is the debate on the structural transformation, and this debate has largely improved our understanding of the importance of industrial development and of different patterns of structural transformation for growth and job creation. And this literature also identifies manufacturing as a leading sector in productivity and employment growth in low and middle income countries. And I'm focusing here on low and middle income countries. So this paper brings together these two debates, and it argues that education drives industrial development and through that economic growth. However, in contrast to traditional economic growth models, it argues that education structures rather than education levels are the driving force. So the argument is that different education structures result in different patterns of industrial development, and these different patterns then determine the level of industrial development and economic growth. And this issue is highly relevant for African countries, which have invested heavily in education in the past and are committed to continuous investment in education. And our research shows that most African countries have developed education structures which provide limited options for industrial development. So the question is, what kind of education structures should African countries develop in order to promote industrial development and growth? In my presentation, I will first introduce, very briefly, a framework which takes a structural approach. Then I provide empirical evidence from cross-country analysis. And finally, I provide lessons for sub-Saharan African countries. We developed a knowledge-based framework, which means that we try to explain, we distinguish between the industrial development, the productive sphere, and the education sphere, and arguing that industrial development patterns are described by two distinct dimensions, which is on the one hand, the importance of manufacturing in total economy, the size of the relative size of manufacturing, and the level of sophistication and technologies within the manufacturing sector. And we are arguing that the industrial development patterns or the structure determines the nature of tasks of activities to be performed within this manufacturing sector, and thereby the industrial structure defines the knowledge and skills profile of jobs in the manufacturing sector. And at the same time, the education structure is defined by the 6 dimensions of non-scholars, primary, incomplete primary, complete primary, secondary, post-secondary education, and so on. And we argue that the relative share of these different educational levels in the labor force determines the knowledge structure in the labor force. So on the one hand, we have the knowledge structure in the labor force created by formal education to some extent. And at the other hand, we have the knowledge and skills profile of jobs in the economy. And we argue that the relationship between these two is that the education structure in the labor force determines the potential patterns of industrial development. So basically we argue that the options for industrial development are to a large extent defined by the educational structure of the labor force. And this idea of options means that the education structure determines the options, but these options are of course not automatically translated into industrial development. That means also other country-specific conditions like the size of the market, the institutions, or comparative advantages in cost structures determine then whether options embodied in the education structures are actually translated into industrial development. We tried to test this framework in an empirical analysis. We undertook a cross-country study of 78 low and middle-income countries from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. The European countries were the former transition countries. We measured the industrial development level with the Industrial and Technological Advancement Index, the ITA, which was developed by UNIDO about some years ago. And this ITA is composed of two components. One is the Industrial Advance Index, which measures the share of manufacturing in total production and in export. So it's also a combined index, bringing together different measures, but measuring how important is the manufacturing sector in the economy. And then we have the second component, which is the Technological Advance Index, which measures the share of medium and high technology products in manufacturing and export. That basically measures the level of sophistication within the export sector. And then we measure educational attainment, as usual, with the average years of schooling in the labor force. And we measure the structure of education by the relative share of the different educational categories in the labor force. How do we do that? We developed a typology of educational attainment structures. So when you look at the we have basically developed 7 different structures by analyzing the shares of these different educational categories in all these countries, trying to identify patterns. And we identified these 7 patterns. There's one, the L shape. This is which you find at very low levels of education, where the left share, the share of non-scholars, and the share of incomplete primary, the blue and the red, is extremely high, and the share of lower, upper, and post-secondary education is extremely low. Then we have the L+, which has the shape of the L shape, the form of the L shape, but higher shares of upper and post-secondary education. This is important because we find that makes a big difference whether you have when you look at the Pakistan, it's an example for that. Then we have the dual structure, which means it's a kind of, you also have, like in the L shape, high non-scholars and low primary, but you have higher shares of lower, upper, and post-secondary when compared to the L shape. So you have the middle categories are more developed. Then we have the missing middle. And the missing middle and the strong middle, these are the 2 categories which are at the, you find in countries with higher levels of education. So these are the more advanced, educationally more advanced countries. In the missing middle, you have polarized patterns. So you have high non-scholars and primary, so the left one. And you have, the middle is very low upper and secondary education. And then you have very high post-secondary education. And the post-secondary, so tertiary, is exceeding the upper secondary education. And finally, we have the strong middle. And the strong middle education categories, they form a bell curve with the primary, lower or upper secondary education being very strong. Okay, so this is strong middle. The missing middle is the polarized. We can, very briefly, we find that the L shape is mainly found in African countries. The dual is found mainly in Arab countries. The missing middle is found mainly in Latin American countries, and the strong middle is mainly found in Asian and in European countries. So you can see these are also regional differences, which also indicates that these structures are, of course, the result of a long-term educational policies and investment patterns. So you have, of course, different principles shaping public and private investment in education sectors and the allocation within these sectors, and that results in these different patterns. Now, the empirical findings. First of all, we looked at the education levels measured by average years of schooling and the industrial development levels measured by ETA. And you find that you have a simple correlation, shows that you can explain that average years of schooling explains about 1/3 of variation in the industrial development level, which is not so fantastic. What is more important to see, look at the two, we have two groups of countries where you have basically no correlation. The one is the low group. Can you, here, you see below 0.1. You have a huge group of countries with average years of schooling between 0.5 and almost 9, but you hardly have any variation in the ETA level, okay? And then you have a group of countries which is basically vertical. These are the countries which have around between 9 and 10 years of average years of schooling, you know, at the very right. And you have, these countries have very different ETA levels, but they all have this, basically the same level of education, so there's no positive correlation. Okay, so education levels by themselves don't explain neither industrial development nor economic growth. Another empirical finding is that education structures determine the options for reaching high levels of industrial development. So our argument is education structures open up certain options, okay, for industrial development. So we see that the L structure, this is the left one, group of left country group, they have an ETA level, they all are below 0.1. Then we have the L plus and the dual, they both have ETA below 0.2. The missing middle countries, these are the two red ones, we have good, I try very hard, we have good performers with ETA. The good performers are with an industrial development level between 0.2 and 0.3. Okay, so they are higher than the other two ones, but they have only few which really can go beyond this 0.2. This is basically Thailand, Brazilian, Costa Rica, and South Africa, so emerging countries. What is very important to see is look at the strong middle. Half of all countries are high performers with an ETA above 0.3. So you not only have many more countries which reach high levels, but they also reach levels which the missing middle countries cannot reach. Okay? How do countries achieve that? They achieve that by creating options for shaping distinct patterns of industrial development. So the higher levels are achieved by different patterns of industrial development. We have distinguished between the two dimensions. One is the share of manufacturing, basically widening the manufacturing, industrial widening the sector within the economy. And the other dimension is improving sophistication and the technological level within manufacturing. Now, let's look at the strong middle countries and the missing middle countries, the two higher level, okay? Look at the strong middle. You can see these countries with the circle. They achieve both high levels of very high manufacturing, large manufacturing base. So the manufacturing sector is large, and at the same time, they increased the level of technology within the broad base of the industry, of the manufacturing base. In the missing middle, you have very different options. You have, look at this circle in the missing middle. The countries are like on a line between 0.4 and 0.5, the ETA. So their industrial base, their manufacturing base in the economy is lower when compared to the strong middle. And how can they expand their industry? Mainly by increasing the level of technology. So they have very limited options in really increasing. And this is, you can explain it by the education structure. When you have a very narrow secondary base, secondary education, then you cannot really expand your manufacturing. What can you do? You have all your tertiary, your university people. With them, you can, of course, relatively easily improve the technology in your narrow base. And the other ones, the strong middle, they have the very broad secondary base, and they can broaden their manufacturing, and then they basically, by slowly increasing their tertiary education, can then also increase the level of technology. So they have completely different options for patterns of industrial development, which allows the strong middle to reach very high levels, and the missing middle to reach a limit. I skipped that. Now, what we see in sub-Saharan Africa, most countries in sub-Saharan Africa have the L-shaped structure, okay? Which means they have very high shares non-scholars, incomplete or complete primary education, but the other categories, secondary and tertiary, is extremely low. So they have low levels of education, low diversity, and low complexity of formal knowledge in the labor force. And they also have, therefore, lowest levels of industrial development due to the low manufacturing base, the low technological levels, or low levels in both dimensions, which you can see that most of the countries are below 0.3 of ETA and below 0.3 of the technical advance index. So these are basically the L shape. You have few countries in Africa which have different educational structures. And this is, for example, South Africa, which is at the right, which has a missing middle. You have Zimbabwe, you have Lesotho. You see, the blue colors are the L-shaped, but the other colors are different shapes. And you can see, whenever you move out of the L shape, you can reach, you can achieve higher levels of industrial development by changing your options into the manufacturing base or technology. What are the policy implications for Africa? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here now with the policy implications. First, what is important is recognize the role of education structures, not just levels, in defining options for industrial development. We call this social capabilities, a knowledge structure in your society, in your labor force, which allows you to reach high and good patterns of industrial development, which allows you to reach high levels. This is a social capability. Formulate education policies that transform the L-shaped education structure towards a strong middle structure. Didn't show that now, but shifting into the L+ is not a solution. Shifting into the dual can be a transitional way to then move on to strong middle structures. But strong middle structures are the education structures countries should go for. And that has been observed in all successful catching up countries. Accelerate the process of transforming education structures to speed up the dynamics of productive transformation. So the transformation of the education structure has to precede productive transformation, because you first have to create the options. Next, align education policies with industrial policies to translate the options into productive capacities and to create productive jobs. So it's not just enough to create the options, you also need then to go into the real economy and promote investment and productive capacities and so on. So in order to align education policies and industrial policies, which relates to trade, technology, investment policies, a government needs to develop a strong long-term industrial development vision. And finally, and this is important, this strategy needs to integrate a training strategy to ensure that workers acquire the industry, technology, and job-specific skills and competences required for efficient performance. And this is the human capital perspective. This is when we talk about human capital. That human capital perspective means this model assumes we have the technologies, we have the production, and then we invest in those skills we need for efficient production. The capability approach I presented here gives a completely different function to education. It says education needs to precede technological development because the structure in the labor force defines what kind of technologies and what kind of products and activities a country can develop. Thank you very much for your attention.